Hey, Stephen. Thanks a lot for coming on and talking to me today.
So glad to, Jake. Good to see you.
So I came across your work with your book, the Dharma in Difficult Times, or just Dharma in Difficult Times. Just out of curiosity, just for some of your background, what kind of led you down this path of um, this work that you do and studying, the Gita specifically? A lot of your books seem to be centered around that and the yoga
Yeah.
traditions. What took you down that road?
So I started out really as a very serious Buddhist practitioner when I was in graduate school. And that was a long time ago. That was in the 70s. Uh, it became clear that if you're practicing meditation back in those days, it became clear that it would be a good idea to do yoga along with it.
Hmm.
Because yoga, the classical yoga tradition, sees itself as a preparation for meditation. So postures and everything we think about as yoga is really meant to be a preparation for letting the mind go deep. So I started doing yoga and I got really into it. Um, I had a I ended a long-term relationship at that point during graduate school and was kind of in breakdown, and I decided to take a year off and kind of take a sabbatical leave and go to this place called Kripalu, which was then the largest yoga center in America. And I I went to Kripalu for a year, and it was just fantastic. It was a very vital community with a lot of really smart, interesting people. Back in those days, I went there in 1989. There were 350 of us living together in this big old Jesuit monastery in the Berkshires and creating an amazing community of teaching and practicing. And so when I got into that, I decided to leave my psychotherapy practice and begin to investigate the relationship between Western psychology and Eastern psychologies. And they were very interested in that because it was a very forward-looking, interesting community. So, so I dived into yoga deeply as I had dived into Buddhism, and it doesn't take long after diving into yoga to figure out that kind of the most interesting and accessible text and treatise on the yoga in the yoga tradition is the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, this is the scripture that everybody in India knows. Unlike some of the other scriptures of yoga that are very esoteric,
Mhm.
this one is a story. It's a story about a dialogue between God and a human being, and a very neurotic human being at that, so we could all identify.
Mhm.
So I just got really interested in the Gita. And one of the things I realized was um, it's not that accessible a text. It's kind of a little bit of a dog's dinner of yoga philosophy. So you can't really read it without a commentary and a guide and a good
Mhm.
translation.
Yeah.
So I started trying to figure out, and this has been an enduring interest of mine, is how to take really important ancient scriptures and translate them into a form that's really usable for Western students. So I spent years trying to figure out what's the best way of teaching the Gita, because it's incredibly practical, very useful for people. And I came upon this four-pillar path idea, and I started teaching it. It was very successful. And so I'd already written a number of books, but I think that the Gita book, my first book on the Gita, was The Great Work of Your Life.
Mhm.
And that became hugely successful. People who wanted to understand the Gita but hadn't found like a little doorway in through
Yeah.
that. And even people who are fairly sophisticated in Gita studies. So I just got fascinated with the Gita, and then I discovered, of course, all these great Western minds that have been influenced by it. And Yeah, so it's been an enduring interest. Not my only interest, but I have two books out of my seven that are Gita oriented.
Yeah. It seems like for me, when I think of yoga, I think of like movement practices, but it
Mhm.
seems like that's more of a narrow view than what it actually is. What all does that, I mean, roughly what all does the yoga tradition include outside of just, movement practices for physical health? Because there's a lot more there, like mentally, spiritually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So really the yoga tradition begins way back in around the first millennium BCE. And it begins very much as a meditation practice. The early scriptures of yoga were all about meditation.
Mhm.
So the great scripture of yoga, the Yoga Sutra, which was probably published in about the second century of the Common Era, was a meditation document, right? So it all began. Actually, the seeds of it began back in Vedic times, which are prior to 1000 BCE, when the monks and priests began to chant these huge volumes of sacred poetry. And they discovered that when they were chanting over and over again, these sacred syllables over and over again, that their minds became very focused and one-pointed and concentrated. So they discovered that when you give the mind a, a focus and let the mind become absorbed in that single pointed focus, then the mind begins to get very quiet. And this was really the origin of meditation. It's the origin of concentration meditation, which is the first form of meditation, where you find an object. Very often it's the breath or the sensations of the breath at the tip of the nostrils. You aim awareness at that object, you come back again and again to the object, you let the awareness sink in. And this is the beginning of the meditative mind. So that goes all the way back to that interesting discovery by the Brahmin priests uh, of how to make the mind one pointed. Um, and then that slowly became articulated into a whole
Mhm.
meditation tradition that finally burst into bloom with the publication of the Yoga Sutra in the second century. And actually, the postures in any really formal form didn't even come along until medieval India. So keep in mind the meditation tradition all the way back to the earliest part of the first millennium of the Common Era. Then around 1400, 1500, when Europe was in the Dark Ages, along come these scriptures of physical yoga, hatha yoga.
Mm.
Right? But from the beginning, those postures were always meant to be preparation for meditation. Um,
Preparation for.
Preparation for
That's
meditation.
interesting.
So postures and breathing exercises, they figured out very early that these things help the mind to calm down and the brain to drop into a different zone. And so it wasn't really even until the 1500 of the Common Era that you had something really called Hatha Yoga, which was all about, oh, these physical practices can transform the body all by themselves.
Yeah.
But even so, for the most part, I think you'll find most really deep yoga adherents um, really practice deep meditative forms and not just postures.
So it started with the chanting before they came to the breath as one of those things that could sustain, or I guess
Absolutely.
like pacify the mind in a way. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting that you said preparation for it, because what I was thinking as you were talking about this was that maybe it's where my mind was going was you have meditation and then the extension of meditation into physical movement would be like the exercise aspect of yoga, but maybe it's the other way around. It's where the postures were meant to get you into that state, not something that follows.
Yeah. Actually, when when we use the word posture or asana, asana literally means posture. It was the posture for meditation. It was the lotus posture,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now something interesting happens, which is that yogis sitting in deep states of meditation did begin to notice that the body began to move spontaneously, right? So most of the physical postures, if you see those lists of postures, those emerge spontaneously in the bodies of deep yogi meditators, right? Starting out in lotus pose, breathing, diving down, and then all of a sudden the hands start to move in what are called mudras. Mudras are like little postures for the hand. You've probably seen
Okay.
these. And so suddenly the subtle energy routes in the body begin to open up, and the hands move, and then the arms move, and then the whole body moves. And the yogis found that if they surrendered to these movements that seemed to arise spontaneously, that this helped to purify the body and to move the energy up to the seventh chakra, which is awakening, basically. So
That's interesting.
it's funny. I mean, it kind of was both, Jake. It was both meant as a preparation, but it was also the result of deep meditative states.
So that they weren't forcing themselves to stay in the lotus position. They would allow themselves to stay in that state of meditation and kind of move around.
They began to explore that. So
Yeah.
you got to keep in mind, these early yogis were very innovative. They were really into exploring everything. And
Mm-hmm.
it really takes the whole, it's the whole gamut between very magical, even black magical stuff, all the way to the most refined, highly sattvic, we might say, or spiritual. So they were up for investigating anything that might transform their consciousness. That included diet, all these weird things. I mean, if you go to India even now, you will see a yogi, an old man, standing on one leg with a beard down to his waist and his face all covered with paints. He's got his own little weird trip, right?
Yeah.
And so they were extreme, but out of that came some really highly sophisticated understanding of the way in which the brain and the nervous system are transformed by these practices. And some of it was not stuff that we definitely would want to repeat these days.
Sure. How did you guys balance that at Kripalu? That like we have these traditional practices that seem to work, where you like kind of follow these steps while also allowing some room for people to just kind of like figure out what works for them. Especially if you're like teaching classes or having training, it seems like that would, you would be encouraged to have some kind of a standardized method. So like there's a balance between that structure and spontaneity there. How do you guys manage that?
Yeah, that's very prescient, Jake. That's exactly right. Really, with beginning students, you have to begin with a fairly rigorous, disciplined, and structured training program, just to begin teaching people, first of all, how to connect with the inner world. We always say early meditators, new meditators don't really meditate. They just begin to get used to
Yeah.
connecting with the extreme strangeness of the inner world, the world of sensation and movement and thoughts. And you have to work your way through that before you get to any kind of real discipline. So we have mapped out a path at Kripalu, which begins with this highly disciplined, structured path. But toward the end, you get a lot of freedom to listen to your own guidance, because everything in the yoga path is about helping you attune to your inner wisdom, to the awake mind. I wrote about this in the second chapter of, I think, the book that you've read. But all of the practices are about that kind of attunement and discernment. So as you grow in that, you begin to get your own guidance. Oh, this is the particular version of yoga that I'm called to, right? And it eventuates in something that we call meditation in motion, which is where you simply lie down the mat on the mat, listen inside, listen to your body guide you into whatever postures it wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is usually the postures the body wants to do are postures that help move the energy in some area of the body where it isn't robust, to clear that area out of dukkha or suffering or junk, whatever you want to call it. So I do that. Like when we're done here, I do this at my own gym right across the street. I will lie down on the mat, meditate a little bit, listen inside, and my body starts to move. And it starts to move in exactly the way that it needs to. It's not, I'm not imposing any structure on it, but that's a fairly advanced kind of practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that as a counter to, with me growing up, I grew up with a sports background and there was a lot of disciplined practice with sports. And a lot of times, with the coaching pressure and games coming up or, all these factors, you end up pushing through things you probably shouldn't be pushing through. And this seems like you wouldn't, like there are times when you are, you're taught in a way to override what your body's telling you. Like my shoulder is not doing well today, but we're doing this stuff anyway. My knee's kind of hurting. Like, I don't know. I don't feel good. But I like that counter to you're just kind of letting it do what it needs to do. And if a certain part of your body needs a break, you're fine to give it that. Now, of course, it's a non-competitive act. It's a very singular internal game. So those two worlds are different. But I'm compelled by that idea, and to the point of a disciplined practice then leading up to more freedom and spontaneity. It seems almost like the goal is to be able to have that state of awareness 24/7, and maybe something like a seated meditation is the direct way to get you in touch with something that you're probably not in touch with already. So something like if you're trying to get your diet under control, and at first maybe you're counting calories, but then eventually, and you're tracking what you're eating, and then eventually the goal is to eat more intuitively. Is it something like that?
Totally. I mean, look, my life is littered with friends who injured themselves in sports when they were young. Like my buddy Pete has a shoulder, a knee, a butt. Everybody had.
We're all banged up, like everybody.
It's just crazy. And then they get to be my age and they're really immobilized.
Yeah.
So what's missing there is something in the yoga world we call proprioception, which simply means one's own capacity to tune in to the body, to perceive the subtle messages coming back from the body. And I think in Western sports, we systematically try to dampen that down, right? So don't worry about your shoulder. It'll be okay. Just push through it.
Yeah.
In yoga, it's just the opposite. Tune into that. How does it want to move? And where does it want to move? And it's not only saner, but it's very pleasurable, right? To listen to the body and it's just like that first early morning stretch. Your body knows how to do it. It knows exactly what it wants, right? Or I see you have a dog on your
yeah.
I'm a huge dog guy.
Yeah.
So the dog, my puppy, she knows exactly how to stretch. And it's beautiful to watch her do her down dog and her up dog and her stretch. And she loves to stretch out on her back.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very natural.
Yeah. It is. It's funny watching dogs because it's they're not they're a pretty good example of not forcing stuff.
Right.
They're when they're excited, they run around. When they're tired, they lay down. It's if you watch them, they're not overthinking stuff at all. It's kind of funny.
At all. I mean, my puppy is a spaniel and she's a hunter. So she just loves to express her native instinct, which is to chase a squirrel. And the other day she she got off her leash. She chased a deer through the woods for like half an hour. I was freaking out because I didn't know where she was.
Yeah.
But finally, she emerges from under this little bush, and she's covered with briars, and there's a branch sticking out of her halter, and she's so happy.
Yeah.
She's just expressed her true nature.
Mm.
That's what yoga is all about. It's just about expressing your true nature. Unfortunately, we've tried to quiet down those instincts, but Wordsworth wrote a great poem about this, the Ode on Immortality. When we come in as babies, we come in with all these instincts, but then we slowly shut them down. And yoga is about opening them up, opening up your connection with the awake part of your mind. And whoa, discovering that you get guidance from moment to moment if you're paying attention.
Yeah.
And that when you follow that guidance, good stuff happens.
And that's one of the bigger themes of the book, is that's the thing that allows you to get in touch with your Dharma. It seems like Dharma has several interpretations or things that it could mean depending on the tradition. Could we clarify, I guess, what you mean by Dharma in relative to this book?
So Dharma is one of those very complex Sanskrit words that in Buddhism, you'll usually hear it meaning path or law or truth or true nature. But in regard to the Bhagavad Gita, to this one text, it always means true calling or sacred duty. Sacred duty is really a better translation. It comes from the root dhr, the Sanskrit root dhr, which means to hold together. And the root comes from this great myth that I talk about in the book, of the great god Rudra. No, which god is it? Anyway, the great god who had cast a net over the entire universe. And at the warp and woof strand of the net, of each warp and woof strand, there's a gem. That gem is an individual soul. And it's that soul's job to hold together that part of the net. So every human being has a job, has a calling, has a dharma, a sacred duty. And it's simply to hold together their part of the web of life. But it's all connected. So if you don't hold together your part of the web, the whole thing starts to unravel from there.
Yeah.
So this is a connection between the highly idiosyncratic particular dharma that I have and the universal. If they're deeply intertwined and connected. If I don't do my little, I'm a writer, I'm writing away here in my little studio, that's my job, that's what I do, but it connects to the whole web. So it's connected to the universal, essentially.
Yeah, I think the Indra's net metaphor is really cool, and it seems like it does a really good job of demonstrating the philosophy as a whole. Another part in there is that each gem reflects all the others. Could you go into what that means?
Yeah. So there was so back in the day at Kripalu, I think we've explained enough about Kripalu for people to get that. Our teacher, who was Amra Desai in those days, a very famous Indian Swami or teacher of yoga, was very gracious in inviting lots of other Indian Swamis and teachers and Western teachers in to teach us. And there was at one point this great Rishi named Rishi Prabhakar, who's now passed away. But we were having a 2-week seminar with Rishi Prabhakar, who was a brilliant non-dual teacher, right? Non-dual teacher. And at one point he made everyone, all 350 of us, stand up individually and say and declare, I am the mother of the world. What does that mean? That means that my actions have profound existential meaning. My little actions right here in my little studio affect the whole world. right? So the part is in the whole, and the whole is in the part. And that's a profound mystical concept
Mm-hmm.
that you find in really in every tradition. The part is in the whole, and the whole is in the part. So
Yeah.
it matters what I do. It matters what I say and how I live. It matters to the whole thing. Now, that's very interestingly become anathema in our current culture, where there's this sense of anonymity and people can say whatever they want and it doesn't mean anything. But Thoreau was onto this, by the way. I wrote a whole chapter about
Mm-hmm.
Thoreau in this new book, and Thoreau said, no matter how small the beginning, any act that is well done, that is done with everything you've got, uh, is done forever. No matter how small the beginning, every act that is well done is done forever. That means it affects the universal.
Yeah.
It goes beyond time. So this is a very powerful principle. This idea, we're back to the three words, the three-letter syllable DHR, which means to hold together.
Mm-hmm.
So Dharma, actually, our Dharma holds the whole thing together.
And then the concept in the book being that in, being Dharma in difficult times, so in hard times in your life, that's when your Dharma can get you through those things, and also get other people through their things that they're going through, as you go through various great people throughout history, and like ways that they've helped out a lot of people by pursuing that Dharma. But it's also a thing like with Beecher that you mentioned, it's a way that you can find yours as well, so you have both of those things going on.
That's right.
um and Thoreau's idea of no matter how small, anything well done is done forever, that seems to really like reverberate throughout the book, and influence Gandhi's ideas of nonviolence and the ends not justifying the means. Is that related to karma? Is that like tied in?
Yeah, absolutely. So karma, I did explore karma a little bit in the chapter on Thoreau.
Mm,
But again, this idea that it matters existentially how we live our lives every moment,
yeah.
because each action of body, speech, and mind, and in the contemplative traditions, um, actions are not just outward actions, but actions of the mind. So every action of body, speech, and mind that's motivated by greed, hatred, and delusion, the three poisons in the Buddhist tradition, plants a seed of suffering for yourself and for all beings. So every time I lie, cheat, steal, it has an impact. We're interconnected, so it has an impact on the whole field, and it plants seeds of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas contrary-wise, every act of body, speech, and mind that's motivated by love, compassion, sympathetic joy, gratitude, plants a seed of happiness that will eventually proliferate into more happiness for me and more happiness for the world. So it, you can't really understand the existential import of small acts of body, speech, and mind
Yeah.
without understanding the idea of karma.
Yeah. The karma idea, and throughout the book, you get like the feeling seems to be that this is much more um something that you kind of feel your way to. It's an intuitive way of living rather than something that you're thinking your way to or rationalizing your way to. Karma seems like it's something that you could very easily, it could cause some kind of anxiety of like, every little decision, like this idea that like each thing that I do has incomprehensible impact on the rest of the world. It seems like you could pretty easily overthink if you're interpreting that in the wrong way. And then
Right.
there's also in the book that flip side of like spontaneity and intuitive living. You talk about Gandhi and Sojourner Truth being very like unpredictable and spontaneous.
Mm-hmm.
What's that kind of balance there to understand the importance of your actions while not like wobbling too much from overthinking?
Well, if you're attuned to the inner voice, as Sojourner Truth was, as Gandhi was. I mean, remember Gandhi said, the only tyrant I allow in my life is a still small voice.
It's a great quote from the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you really understand Gandhi, you discover that he was moved continually by this inner spirit and this inner wisdom. And it basically told him to do this, and he'd do
Mm-hmm.
that. And it was the same with Sojourner Truth. And I wrote in the earlier book about Harriet Tubman, exactly the same thing. So when you're attuned to the right channel of that inner guidance, you can't make a mistake. But very often the actions that you're called to do are surprising, sometimes radical, incomprehensible sometimes to the world. That's why Gandhi, nobody could understand Gandhi. The British had a whole unit that was dedicated to trying to understand Gandhi. I love this because they were trying to understand him without any real understanding of the source of his spiritual power, which was his inner guidance. And so, when anybody else would have moved, he sat still. And when anyone else would have sat still, he moved.
Yeah.
And so he just drove the British crazy. I love when you look at the correspondence that comes out of the British, like MI5 or whatever it was called then, they're like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
Nobody can understand him. And it was the same with Sojourner Truth. Like, she did the most counterintuitive things because she was listening to her guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And you remember, if you read the chapter, that she was on her cart with her horse or donkey, and she would just throw the reins up and say, okay, horse, you lead now. Let's see
Yeah.
where we go, right? And then they'd land in this little village, and she'd set up shop in the center of the square and put all her signs up and get up on the platform of her wagon and preach.
Mm-hmm.
All intuitive.
Yeah. Yeah. With Gandhi, like the funny part of them trying to figure out what he was doing is he probably didn't even really know either. Like on some level, like he probably didn't know how to explain it either. He was kind of just doing stuff because he was, I mean, and that's one of the bigger themes is like surrendering to that power, that divine power, whatever you want to call it. He's kind of just letting go and letting it guide him, which it sounded very Taoist in nature. I wasn't aware of like how similar that idea of non-doing was in both of those traditions.
It's the very centerpiece of both of them.
Yeah.
But the real practice of the path of the Gita is called Neshkarman Karman, which means the doctrine of inaction and action.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, yeah, Gandhi wasn't doing it. He didn't think he was doing it. It was
Mm-hmm.
being done through him.
Yeah.
And that requires a moment by moment surrender of the outcome, because he didn't know, maybe he was meant to die, and he did die,
Right.
and he surrendered. And that's at the heart of, I think, most of the great wisdom traditions, including Taoism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm completely fascinated by the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
And and it absolutely required, to live the way of the Tao requires that surrender and that attunement, like
Yeah.
moment by moment attunement.
Yeah. I'm very interested in that idea. I remember it's kind of funny, like you talked about in the beginning of difficulties in reading the text directly. I think you cited the Stephen Mitchell version of the Tao Te Ching. I read
Yeah.
that one, and there was another one that I read before I ever read like really any interpretations of it, and I was like, wait, like what is he talking about? Like I couldn't figure out what he was saying, but being able to like dive into that and like listen to people explain it is very interesting. And I like the example that you used of Sojourner Truth, just like letting go of the reins. Like it seems like a pretty good metaphor for that. And it was funny. She said something along the lines of like she would go into speeches just out of curiosity as to what she would say. It seems as somebody like with me in school with like public speaking, I was very, very nervous of that and I'd get anxious. Um, that seems like that's a terrifying approach for people. Like how do you sink into that of just being like, well,
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest with you. have never learned to do that. I do a lot of public speaking, but it's always very well prepared.
Yeah.
And you know, Marion Woodman, whom I wrote about in my last book on Dharma, one of the great Jungian analysts, she was the great feminist Jungian analyst of the
What,
20th
what
century.
was her name? Sorry.
Marion Woodman,
Okay.
Woeman. She and I taught together for years, and she was a wonderful person. But I was there. I remember when she said, okay, starting today, I'm never going to use another note in my talks. And she winged it, and it was brilliant. Sometimes it wasn't, right?
Yeah.
But often it was brilliant. And I've never been able to do that. I have to have I
Yeah.
have my notes, right?
Yeah.
One time I was giving a talk. I was on a panel at the Jewish Community Center in New York City, and it was with Danny Shapiro, who's now become a very famous author, and Sylvia Boorstein, and a rabbi. And we were in the green room, and we walked out, and I didn't have any notes. I thought I can wing this one. And there were like hundreds and hundreds there must have been 700 or 800 people there, packed. And my mind went completely blank. I couldn't have told you my name, honestly.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to get, once I did get back on track, I was pretty good. But yeah, the anxiety was huge.
Yeah. It's almost something that like if you're gonna go down that route, you have to commit fully because like like the second that
Yeah,
that anxiety gets in and you start like grabbing for like notes and ideas that you had before, it's gonna fall apart. So it's like
it's
something
going to
that you
fall
have to
apart.
like you have
Yeah,
to go all in on that. But
yeah,
I like the idea of like heavy prep and then you just go, all right, I kind of know what I'm talking about, and now I'm just gonna
yeah.
go and like deviate from the notes. It's like that seems like a decent way to balance it. I certainly couldn't do like I'm not gonna prep and then just run into it and then like there's
That's a Yeah, that's a specialized school. You know, I went to Episcopal Divinity School to be an Episcopal priest, but because I'm gay, they didn't allow me to become a priest. So we had classes in giving sermons, and it became very clear that some of the trainees were able to do that spontaneous off the cuff thing, and others just weren't.
Mhm.
And I just wasn't. I think it's okay. It's a forgivable sin.
I mean, yeah, I mean, ultimately to each their own. Because I mean, it seems like even from this perspective and from Taoist perspectives, maybe like Zen perspectives, various ideas of like non-forcing, like it would also be a form of forcing if you're like trying to not let yourself prepare, if that's the way that
Yeah,
works best for you.
exactly. Exactly. When I speak publicly, I really want to value the time of the people who are listening.
Hmm.
So I want to give them something really coherent and concise, and um, you know, and I that's just who I am. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like back to that Dharma idea of like each person goes their natural way and like that makes things mesh together. Like you're gonna have the people that go up there and wing it, and then you're gonna have the people that like to be a little bit more structured. And, like
Right.
it's like having like creative people and artists versus like more linear thinkers. Like you kind of need both.
That's right. I'm a very linear thinker. And also, this is an interesting point about Dharma or true calling, sacred duty. So there are some things that you're called to that you don't even really love doing. Okay. I'm a very good public speaker, but it's only because I've worked my ass off for years to learn how to do it and to learn to manage the anxiety around it. And I'm 74 years old now, and I'm still just as anxious as I was 35 years ago when I started. So that's been my calling, not my only calling. Writing is really easy for me. I love writing. It's very fluid and there's no anxiety. Um, Although you'll hear about writers who have tons of anxiety. I
Mm-hmm.
don't. But sometimes there are components of your Dharma that are really challenging. And eh, that's just that's been part of my Dharma. So I have to learn to live with it.
Well, that's a really interesting point and an interesting topic that I wanted to touch on, which is there's various ideas in like self-help world and various philosophies and whatnot of is it follow your passion? Is it follow what you're good at? Dharma seems to be somewhere in between. Ideally, you would want to find an intersection. Are those things overthinking, or do you kind of, is like trying to structure it even in that way? Or is it kind of just like you just go where you're pulled and it just like you just work it out as you go?
It's a little bit of both, really, because
Yeah.
when I'm teaching, so in the West, the discernment of Dharma is the most important phase, because keep in mind, in the East, for millennia, people were born into their Dharma. Arjuna was
Right.
born as a warrior. He couldn't change that. You couldn't
Yeah.
change. But here we are. Okay, I'm 25 years old. What the heck am I? What am I called to do? And I point people toward three what I call fruitful hunting grounds for Dharma. The first one is what lights you up. Okay, that's very important. Go all the way back to Joseph Campbell, follow your bliss. What lights you up? That's a real finger pointing at your Dharma. It's very unlikely you're going to have a Dharma that doesn't light you up in some way.
Yeah.
There's a second area that I point people to, which is what's your duty? Because we do have authentic duties. And I like to say that your duty is that thing which, if you do not do it in this lifetime, you will feel a profound sense of self-betrayal. So your duty is called forth from within. It's not something imposed on you, but we have duties that are called forth from within. I'll give you an
Mhm.
example. My dog, Kenzie, my puppy. So I had not intended to have a dog. I've had dogs my whole life, but recently I haven't. And then my best buddy, Brian, adopted this puppy, Kenzie. I fell in love with her. And I mean, I've never been in love with a dog like this. And it became clear that, oh, raising Kenzie is my Dharma. So Brian and I now have joint custody of Kenzie. He lives across town. He's got her today, or otherwise I'd introduce you. That was not my plan, but I felt this profound duty to this gorgeous animal who I felt connected with. Okay, there's a duty. I didn't ask for it, but it's there. There's no way I can avoid it. I have to embrace that.
Yeah.
So what lights you up? What's your duty? And then the third one is, what challenges or difficulties are you facing in your life? Because very often those difficulties are a doorway into some component of your Dharma,
Mhm.
right? A divorce or an illness or any kind of real difficulty that um, that throws you into the disorienting dilemma that I begin with, can very often be another finger pointing at Dharma. So Marion Woodman, whom we mentioned before, great Jungian analyst, well into her mid-70s. She got bone cancer, was told she would die. She said, no, I'm going to take that as my Dharma, that is the healing of cancer. I'm going to close my analytic practice. I'm going to take on this healing process as my Dharma. And she did, and it was her Dharma, and she was healed, and she lived quite a bit longer, healthy.
So rather than being one vocation necessarily, it's something that uh it's something that can change depending on your conditions.
Totally.
It,
I mean, there are many Dharma myths. One of them is that you have one calling for your whole life. That's just not true. That's not
yeah.
how it works. Dharmas arise, and very often you fulfill them, and when you fulfill them, they pass away.
Hmm.
Right. So I'm in that very position right now. I've had this whole 30-year stretch of writing and teaching and writing and teaching. And for a number of reasons I won't go into, it's kind of come to an end. And I'm entering this phase. It's a phase I call wandering, where you're not clear what your Dharma is, but your Dharma is finding your Dharma.
Right.
Right? Your
Yeah.
Dharma is finding it. So you have to devote yourself, maybe years, to being in that phase of listening and watching and deep listening. And I'm entering into that right now. I'm taking a sabbatical. You'll probably be one of the last podcasts I do. taking a year to do that deep listening, because I'm not
Mhm.
sure what's next. I've been totally sure for 30 years. Now I'm like, not sure. So another
It-
book? I'm not sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
I really like that perspective of like that being the Dharma to find yours. Because it's like you can easily get, especially in, reading ideas like this, of having that calling that just propels you forward. For people who don't feel that way, that can be really kind of stressful. You can be like, what am I doing with my life? I don't know what to do. Everybody's talking about like this thing that pulls you forward. I don't feel anything like that. But accepting that is like, well, finding that thing is the thing that's pulling you forward right now. Like I think that's an interesting way to look at it that may just kind of go under the radar.
It totally goes under the radar. That, to tell you the truth, half of our life is going to be spent looking for the Dharma. Thoreau said one should always be on the trail of one's deepest nature, for it is that that connects you to the divine.
Mm-hmm.
One should always be on the trail of one's true nature. So that means it's a trail. It's not a single point. It's moving, and you're moving with it. And he uses the image of the hunter, right? The hunter who tracks the prey or whatever. You're going to spend a lot of time in life tracking your
Mm-hmm.
Dharma. And if you see that as wasted time or as not your Dharma, that's really counterproductive. No,
Right.
that's Dharma. So I have no ambivalence about this. My Dharma now is tracking. I'm tracking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good perspective for it. It's like, yeah, because otherwise you're gonna, you could start thinking like, I haven't found the thing. I haven't found the thing. I'm like off the path. I haven't found the path. But like really, the path is 24/7.
Totally.
It's just it's constant, and whether or not like wherever that's taking you. So yeah, I really like that idea um of saying like, even if you don't know what it is, like that's still you being on the path is trying to figure it out. That's a good thing to keep in mind, especially for like young people like me who are constantly freaking
Yeah.
out about like, what are we supposed to do? And
Oh
then
my
people
God.
in transitional stages like yourself, where it's like just
Yeah,
any stage where you're like, what am I doing? Like, what am I supposed to do?
exactly. It's totally freeing to understand that half of your life will be spent seeking
Yeah.
Dharma, and that's righteous right there. That's a holy life. Um, you may have periods of what I call certitude when you know what it is, and those are wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
When I call them Dharma assignments. When I get a Dharma assignment, like every single of my 6 books, and I'm working on a seventh now, has been a Dharma assignment. And so I have certitude and clarity, which means I can bring all of my actions together to focus on that Dharma assignment. So it's a little unsettling when you don't have a Dharma assignment, but your assignment is seeking, is investigating
Mm-hmm.
and listening. And you have to give everything you've got to that, to the listening.
I'm really interested in diving into the Gita and trying it out again. Though there's that threat of like misinterpreting it, not understanding what it's saying, like we've been talking about. Do you have any specific like translations or books interpreting it that you would recommend to people who want to learn more about the Gita, as well as of course like the 2 books that you've written most recently?
Yeah, no, I really do. The very best commentary and translation is Eknath Eswaran.
Okay.
That's Eswaran, Eswaran. So Eswaran was a student of Gandhi's in India, who came to this country after Gandhi died and set himself up at UCLA. I think it was UCLA, one of the California universities. And he has that special combination of understanding the Western mind and what we need, and understanding the true meaning of the Gita. So each of the 18 chapters of the Gita is preceded by an essay
Nice.
which illuminates that chapter. And you can't understand the Gita without that. I just
Yeah.
don't. There's nothing even close to that. I mean, I love the Stephen Mitchell translation. And by the way, Oh, okay. We already talked about the Tao Te Ching. Yeah. So Stephen Mitchell also translated the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, it's very poetic. It's beautiful, but to me, it's not as helpful, quite as helpful as the Eknatheswaran.
Not as like detailed commentary on it to help. Yeah, I've seen that one on bestsellers list on Amazon and stuff. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was okay.
It's beautiful if you're interested in the poetry.
Hmm.
I mean, the Gita is, after all, the song of God. It's a song, and it's beautiful poetry. But uh, it can be philosophically, as I said, a real dog's dinner to understand without. It's not linear at all. It's very
Hmm.
all meshed together. So in the yoga tradition, there are 4 or 5 different, very different approaches to yoga philosophy. One is bhakti, the yoga of the heart. Another is jnana yoga, the yoga of the mind. Raja yoga is the yoga of deep, kind of like depth psychology, if you will. Hatha yoga, of course, of the body. And the Gita collapses all of those, intertwines them. And if you don't know what you're looking at, it'll be hard to understand. So Eknatheswaran for sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you have the Dharma in Difficult Times out, which came out in 2022, I think. That you've got, your catalog of books before then and works and podcasts and stuff. Um, you said that you're taking some time and just some space, just to kind of figure out what that next stage is. In the meantime, do you have certain things that you would like to direct people towards to find you and find more of your work? Do you have specific things that you would like them to go to first? Like where can people um, find you and find your work?
Yeah, I think if you're interested in my work, I would start with my book called The Great Work of Your Life. It's very accessible.
Cool.
It's a basic primer on the Gita, and then read the Dharma in Difficult Times. I will still have my website up all year, and so I have my contact page, which I presume is how you found me,
Hmm.
Jake.
Yep.
www.stephencope, Stephen with a ph.com. You can also get me through Kripalu, where I'm still scholar emeritus. And yeah, if you just Google me, and you'll find a ton of resources, all of the podcasts I've done, and a lot of videos that I've done, and so forth. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to find.
Great. Well,
Yeah,
thanks a lot for coming on. I really appreciate talking to you about this. The book was really interesting. I hadn't learned that much about the Gita before, so I'm definitely interested in learning more, and I'll probably go back and read the precursor to this one,
that's
The
great.
Great Work of Your Life. So thanks a lot for coming on and giving me your time today. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Totally. Always something for an Ohio friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Jake. Bye.